Maryland is the 9th smallest state in America. At its narrowest point, it is barely a mile wide. But somehow inside that tiny footprint, you can drive from 3,000-foot Appalachian ridges to Atlantic beaches in a single day, crossing more geographic variety than states 10 times its size. Sandy dunes, tidal marshes, oak-covered Piedmont hills, pine-forested mountains, all packed into about 12,400 square miles. But the land is not even the strange part. The strange part is what the land did to the people who settled it. Maryland built one of America's first religious freedom laws, then used it to persecute the very people it was written for. It fought for the Union while keeping slavery legal. It became the richest state in the country, median household income around $94,000, while its largest city posts a poverty rate above 20% and the worst income inequality in the state. Its flag, the one plastered on crab mallets and craft beer cans, literally stitches together the symbols of both sides of the Civil War. Every American contradiction compressed into 12,400 square miles. And it all starts with a single body of water that cut the state in half before anyone arrived. The Chesapeake Bay runs 193 miles through the center of Maryland, between 3 and 25 miles wide, giving the state roughly 3,200 to 3,600 miles of tidal shoreline. That is more than many coastal states several times its size. The bay does not just dominate the map, it splits Maryland into two separate worlds. The eastern shore is low, flat, and marshy. Watermen villages, crab fisheries, and small towns that look and feel more like the rural Deep South than anything near Washington. Skipjacks still work some of these waters. Churches outnumber stoplights. The rhythm of life follows tides, not traffic. Cross the bay to the western shore and the world changes. The land climbs into Piedmont hills, federal suburbs, and the dense urban corridor between Baltimore and D.C. Office parks replace oyster shacks. Commuter trains replace crab boats. Same state, same water, two completely different cultures staring at each other across an estuary. This split was not created by politics or policy. It was carved by geology. During the last ice age, rivers cut deep valleys through the coastal plain. When the glaciers melted and seas rose, saltwater flooded those valleys, drowning the landscape and creating a barrier that would divide Maryland's identity for the next 4 centuries. The Chesapeake is not just a bay, it is a fault line, and everything that happened in Maryland afterward runs along it. But the bay only explains the geographic split. Maryland's deeper contradictions were baked in from the very first charter. In 1632, King Charles I granted Cecil Calvert a colony designed to be two things at once: a profitable tobacco venture and a refuge for persecuted English Catholics. From its first day, Maryland was an experiment in mixing faith and commerce, idealism and self-interest sharing the same piece of parchment. In 1649, the colony passed the Act Concerning Religion, promising that no person professing belief in Jesus Christ would be troubled for their faith. It is often remembered as a landmark of American religious freedom, one of the first documents in the New World to enshrine the idea that government should not punish belief. But the same law prescribed death for anyone who denied the Trinity. It protected Catholics and Protestants while excluding everyone else. And within decades, the colony's growing Protestant majority flipped the act entirely, stripping Catholics of the right to vote, hold office, and worship publicly in the very colony that had been founded as their sanctuary. The refuge consumed itself. Maryland did not just experiment with tolerance, it demonstrated exactly how fast tolerance collapses when power shifts. That pattern, an ideal and its betrayal living side by side, would repeat across the state's entire history. And it shaped more than just politics. The same charter that mixed faith and commerce also produced two separate economies on two separate landscapes. Southern Maryland and the flat eastern shore had the rich soil and the river access for tobacco plantations and the enslaved labor that came with them. Tobacco wharves lined the tidal creeks. Plantation houses rose on the bluffs. The economy looked south, toward Virginia and the Caribbean trade routes that moved raw goods to European markets. Western Maryland told a completely different story. Its Appalachian ridges and small valleys attracted German freehold farmers and communities that looked far more like Pennsylvania than Virginia. Small plots, family labor, grain crops. No plantation culture, no dependence on enslaved workers. One half of the state connected culturally and economically to the South. The other half leaned north. The Chesapeake ran between them like a seam, holding these opposites together inside a single border. By the time Baltimore grew into a major port in the early 1800s, the city itself had become a living contradiction. Its harbor shipped southern cotton to northern mills. Its warehouses stored goods bound for both worlds. Pro-Union and pro-Confederate sympathies embedded themselves in the same neighborhoods, sometimes the same families. Baltimore was not on the border between North and South, it was the border, compressed into a single city. And that city was about to catch fire. If you want to understand how geography shapes where Americans live, subscribe. Then came April 1861, and Maryland's contradictions exploded into violence. A mob in Baltimore attacked the 6th Massachusetts Regiment as Union soldiers marched between train stations on their way to defend Washington. The rail lines did not connect through the city, so troops had to walk through the streets to change stations. Baltimore's pro-Southern crowd was waiting for them. Paving stones ripped from the road became weapons. Pistol shots cracked above the shouting. By the time the soldiers fought through to Camden Station, 4 soldiers and 12 civilians lay dead on Pratt Street. The first blood of the Civil War spilled not on some distant battlefield. It spilled on a city street in a state that had not even decided which side it was on. And it forced a terrifying calculation in the White House. Look at a map, and the logic becomes obvious. Maryland wraps around Washington on 3 sides. If the state seceded, the nation's capital would be completely surrounded by Confederate territory, cut off from northern rail lines, telegraph wires, and supply routes. The federal government would be an island inside enemy territory. Lincoln's response was extreme and immediate. He suspended habeas corpus, imposed martial law in Baltimore, and ordered the arrest of pro-secession legislators before they could vote. Maryland would stay in the Union, not because it chose to, but because the president refused to let it leave. But here's the contradiction that makes Maryland unlike any other state. It fought for the Union while keeping human beings in bondage. Union soldiers from Maryland marched alongside enslaved people who worked Maryland farms. The state contributed troops to preserve the nation while its own laws preserved slavery. That impossible tension did not resolve until 1864, when a Unionist-driven convention wrote a new state constitution abolishing slavery, making Maryland the first border state to end slavery during the war. The vote was agonizingly close. It only passed because soldiers' absentee ballots pushed it over the line. Freedom won by the narrowest of margins, delivered in envelopes from the battlefield. And then Maryland did something no other state in America has ever done. After the war ended, instead of choosing a side, it chose both. The black and gold Calvert arms had been associated with Unionist Marylanders throughout the conflict. The red and white Crossland banner had been adopted so aggressively by Confederate sympathizers that Union authorities in Baltimore outlawed displaying it. 2 symbols, 2 loyalties, 2 irreconcilable identities. Maryland took them both and quartered them together into a single flag. Officially adopted in 1904, this was not a compromise. It was a declaration. Maryland would carry both identities at once, permanently, stitched into the same piece of cloth. Today that design is everywhere. On crab mallets and beer cans, lacrosse helmets and bumper stickers, tattoos, and tailgate coolers. A symbol born in civil conflict became the state's most beloved brand. Most states bury their internal contradictions beneath a bland seal and a forgettable motto. Maryland put its contradictions on the flag and turned them into a lifestyle. But the flag only reconciled the past. Maryland's modern identity was built by something entirely different: proximity to Washington, D.C. After World War II, the suburban counties surrounding the capital filled with federal workers, defense contractors, intelligence analysts, and STEM professionals. Government agencies that could not fit inside the district spilled across the state line into Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and Arundel County. The National Institutes of Health, the National Security Agency, the Social Security Administration, NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, all of them operating on Maryland soil, all of them pouring salaries into Maryland communities. Today, roughly 229,000 Marylanders hold federal civilian jobs. Federal wages and benefits pump over $26 billion a year into the state economy. Total federal spending flowing into Maryland tops $150 billion annually. That pipeline turned Maryland into the wealthiest state in the country, not through natural resources, not through a single dominant industry, but through geography. The state that happened to border the capital absorbed the capital's payroll. The result is one of the most educated workforces in America, a bachelor's degree attainment rate near 43%, and a median household income that no other state can match. But that wealth is not evenly distributed. It is not even close. Baltimore sits barely 40 miles from some of the wealthiest zip codes in America. You can drive from a neighborhood in Bethesda where the median household income exceeds $200,000 to a block in West Baltimore where a quarter of residents live below the poverty line, and the drive takes less than an hour. The city's poverty rate exceeds 20%. The top fifth of Baltimore households claim 54% of local income. The bottom fifth survive on 2.3%. Those are not numbers from a struggling state in the Deep South. Those are numbers from the richest state in the country. This is not a story about a poor state with a struggling city. Every state has struggling cities. This is the nation's wealthiest state containing one of its most unequal cities, separated by a few exits on the same highway. The suburbs prosper on federal paychecks. The city hollows out. The same geographic corridor that delivers $150 billion in federal spending also concentrates deep, entrenched poverty just a short drive away. Maryland does not just contain wealth and poverty, it puts them in the same frame, close enough to see both at once. And that is exactly why the contradiction stings. Maryland has already crossed a demographic threshold that most of the country is still approaching. By 2020 census data, fewer than half of Marylanders identify as white, roughly 47%. About 29% are Black, 12% Hispanic, 7% Asian. Maryland is the most diverse state on the entire East Coast, more diverse than Washington, D.C. itself. But that diversity is concentrated in the D.C.-Baltimore corridor, where federal jobs, universities, hospitals, and international institutions draw people from every continent. Walk through Silver Spring or Langley Park on any given afternoon and you will hear Spanish, Amharic, Korean, and Tagalog within a few blocks. Drive west into the Appalachian counties and the population becomes far more homogeneous and shrinking. Young people leave for the corridor and rarely come back. Main streets that once anchored small-town life lose a storefront every few years. Cross the bay to the eastern shore and you find communities where the demographics have barely shifted in decades, where the economy still turns on agriculture and seafood, and where the booming corridor feels like a different country entirely. Once again, Maryland contains both versions of America, the diverse, urbanizing future and the rural, aging past, separated by a few dozen miles of highway and a 193-mile estuary. The state that looks like tomorrow in one zip code looks like yesterday in the next. The pattern never breaks. Every Maryland contradiction plays out across the same geography, the same fault line, the same body of water that divided the state before anyone arrived. The Chesapeake Bay, the feature that split Maryland into two worlds, that fostered watermen and suburbs, that gave the state 3,600 miles of shoreline and an identity unlike any other, is under siege. Sea level rise models project that roughly 167,000 acres of undeveloped dry land around the bay could be submerged by 2100. Another 161,000 acres of brackish marsh are expected to drown, replaced by over 266,000 acres of new open water. The shoreline that defined Maryland is being redrawn, not by politics, not by development, but by the same geological forces that created the bay in the first place. What the ocean gave, the ocean is slowly taking back. Blue crab populations, iconic to the state's identity and its economy, have hit record low survey counts in recent years, stressed by climate-driven low oxygen zones, habitat loss, and shifting predator patterns. The waterman culture that gave the eastern shore its character depends on a harvest that is getting harder every season. Families that have worked the same waters for generations now wonder whether their children will have anything left to work. Crab houses that once ran double shifts in summer struggle to fill their steam pots. The docks get quieter every year. The geographic feature that made Maryland what some call America in miniature is itself changing shape. If restoration efforts fail, the shore communities, the marshes, the historic sites that define the state's self-image could literally disappear beneath the water. The land that created Maryland's contradictions may not survive them. Stand on the Appalachian Ridges in Maryland's western panhandle, the narrow waste where the state is barely more than a mile wide, and you are in a landscape that looks like West Virginia. Wooded hills, quiet hollows, mist settling in the valleys at dawn. Drive east and the mountains give way to rolling Piedmont farmland. Keep going and the farms give way to federal suburbs humming with government money, office parks and research campuses lining the Beltway. Push through Baltimore with its gleaming inner harbor and its hollowed-out rowhouse blocks sitting just a few streets apart. Cross the Chesapeake on the Bay Bridge with water stretching to every horizon, gulls wheeling overhead. And finally reach the Atlantic dunes at Ocean City, where the sand meets the open sea. You have crossed the entire range of American geography in a single day inside a single state. Sandy beaches, tidal marshes, oak-covered hills, pine-forested mountains, 12,400 square miles containing every landscape, every divide, every contradiction, north and south, rich and poor, urban and rural, tolerance and persecution, Union and Confederacy, stitched together on the same flag. Every state in America contains some version of a divide. Maryland contains all of them, compressed so tightly that you cannot drive an hour in any direction without crossing into a different world. It is not the opposite of every state because it is broken. It is the opposite because it is everything. Too many Americas packed into too small a space to pretend otherwise. The land decided that long before the people arrived. If you want to see how geography drew similar invisible lines through other states, check out one of the recommended videos on screen. And if you have not already, subscribe.